Hello everyone and welcome back to my channel. For those of you who are new here, my name is Miranda and I am the Enchantress of Avalon. And for today's video, I decided it's going to be an Arthurian legend video. I haven't done an actual just straight Arthurian legend video in quite a while, so I'm excited for this one. And the subject for today's video is the importance of fairy women in the Arthurian legends. And this is rooted really deep in the legends, even though they were written during, the Christian period after the British Isles were being Christianized. There was a lot of paganism still in play, and certainly a lot of carryover in the legends from Celtic pagan lore. And the fairy women are definitely some of the most obvious cases of this. And there are so many fairy women in Arthurian legends. It might be even argued that most of the female figures in Arthurian legends can be looked at through the lens of a fairy origin because they do the same things that fairy goddesses and fairy women do in other Celtic lore. So I am going to start by recommending a couple books. A couple great books that talk a little bit about fairy women of Arthurian legends. There's The Fairy Gates of Avalon by Gareth Knight, and in this he specifically is looking at each of Chrétien de Troyes' Arthurian romances, which I also have that book, The Arthurian Romances by Chrétien de Troyes, and he's analyzing how these stories were adapted by this French author from earlier lore and how it connects to the fairy tradition. It's a brilliant book. I highly recommend it. I also recommend reading Chrétien de Troyes' original Arthurian romances if you're looking into this book. The second book I recommend is Sir Gawain, or some people pronounce his name Gawain. Both are correct. I say Gawain. So, Night of the Goddess by John Matthews. And this is looking at Gawain's story through the lens of these fairy women being originally goddesses and explaining the interrelationship both of Gawain to figures like Morgan Le Fay, as well as the interrelationship between Morgan and Guinevere and how that's working, as they're different goddess aspects, but both were fairy goddesses. So it's a brilliantly done book. And obviously you should probably read the original Sir Gawain and the Green Knight and to go with that book. But to actually get into this a little bit, the traditional function of a fairy goddess or fairy woman in Celtic lore and by extension in Arthurian legend is to serve as a sovereignty figure, to test knights and heroes and kings. This is testing for eligibility to rule or to be a knight and worth to rule to be a knight. And in the Christian period, it transitioned to also testing of knightly virtues. So we see this very clearly in Sir Gawain and the Green Knight. He's being tested of his knightly virtues. And in that case, that's a prime function of fairy women in general in this type of lore. But who else is a fairy woman other than Morgan Le Fay? And I mentioned Guinevere as a fairy woman. Well, Tristan and Isolde, she would be considered a fairy-like woman because, again, that testing of the knight, testing of the king is there. And the romantic link, because there's often a romantic or a sexual component to this testing. And when I mentioned sovereignty, for a king marrying a fairy woman who is a representative of sovereignty, maybe she's a sovereignty goddess herself, maybe she's just a representative of this goddess, it's the literal marriage to the lands. So we see that in the case of Isolde and Mark, but we see it most clearly in the Arthurian legends in the case of course, Arthur and Guinevere themselves. Arthur's right to rule is really cemented by his marriage to Guinevere, his marriage to the land itself. She is a fairy woman. She was a princess in her own right in most versions of the tales, and she is in origin a fairy woman, even if she's not written as such in the particular story that you're reading. She has the markers there, and she follows the traditional pattern of the flower bride, and I've talked about this in other videos. And she also has a connection in my mind with Blodeuwedd, because Blodeuwedd, as the ancient Welsh tales tell us, had a similar dynamic of being married off to a king, like, or a prince who she didn't really have a choice to marry. And the marriage starts off very good, just like Arthur's and Guinevere starts off very good. But it slowly deteriorates to the point where he's ignoring her. And that leaves room for someone who actually will be there and actually will love this woman, this fairy woman. And losing the love of the fairy woman also can make you lose your right to rule. It usually does. In Arthur's case, the deterioration of his marriage to Guinevere opens her up to the love of Lancelot, yes, and you have that love triangle fighting dynamic, but it also opens his kingdom up to fall, because he's lost the blessing of the land itself. He's lost the love of this sovereign figure, of his fairy bride. He no longer has her love because he has ignored her. Now, this is not always the way that they like to tell the tale, but when we look at a lot of the older versions, it often has this distance between the two, where he's off fighting, or he is off, hanging out with the knights and hearing about their exploits. And Guinevere is kind of off to the side, not really getting attention from him anymore. And that in itself is a flaw. And it's the hero rejecting the sovereign figure. It's the king rejecting the sovereign figure. And it leaves him open to be overthrown. In the case of the Arthurian legends, when we look at Lancelot as the knight that Guinevere falls in love with, because in earlier tellings it was other knights, there was often this dynamic from pretty early on in the Arthurian legends that had her falling in love with one knight or another, because Arthur was no longer paying her enough attention. Because she has feelings, she wants to be acknowledged and desired, so losing the attention of her husband, she's seeking attention somewhere else. But in the Celtic lore perspective, this also means that he is losing something, because he's no longer respecting the sovereign figure. He's no longer respecting the land itself. So it'll turn on him. Now, I mean, in the very, very earliest tellings, there really isn't that as much, because they didn't focus on the love triangle dynamic. But still, Arthur has failures that cause him to lose. But in the most common tellings, which is what I was talking about, it's this loss of Guinevere is losing his kingdom for him. Now, the knights don't want to become king in this case, excepting one. I'll explain that in a moment. So it's not this overthrowing, but just ending in his death and the demise of his kingdom. The one that wants to take over is, of course, Mordred. And there are versions where Mordred does have a relationship with Guinevere. And depending on the telling, it's sometimes consensual, sometimes not. Sometimes he's coming in as a usurping figure who takes Guinevere as his bride against her will. And this causes, the final battle eventually. Or there are versions where she conspires with Mordred and does not want to be with Arthur anymore. And this is, again, could be the sovereign figure choosing another to be king in place of the person who is no longer worthy, because it's still that test of worth, of eligibility. And we see it, obviously, I mentioned Gawain. He's not only tested by Morgan, though. Morgan is the one who tests him in Sir Gawain and the Green Knight. But he's also tested by Dame Ragnell. And I did a video on the Loathly Ladies archetype where I talked about this tale in depth. I don't have time to talk about the tale in depth here, but I will basically say that she appeared as this old haggard woman asking to marry him, and it was a test. And he did marry her in order to help Arthur. And on the night of their wedding, she revealed to him, after they were alone, that it wasn't her true form. Her true form was that of a young, beautiful woman. But she was bound by magic to appear one way in the daytime and one way at night. And she told him that she could choose which way. And she wanted him to choose whether he wanted her to be beautiful in public and ugly at night when they were alone, so that he had a beautiful wife to parade around, or whether he wanted her to be ugly during the day and beautiful at night, so he had a beautiful wife to bed at night. And he told her that he didn't want to make that choice, that it was her choice to make because it was her body. And that broke the curse that was upon her. And she was allowed to remain in her true form as a lovely young woman permanently. And again, this is a test. He proved to have respect for her and respect for women in general and for this magic of Faery. So he won the beautiful bride, ultimately. But again, it's respect. And a lot of this hinges on respect. Certainly, the way Morgana is influenced in the legends hinges on respect. Yes, she's testing Gawain. She often tests Arthur. She tests Lancelot. She has an entire Val Saint Retour of knights who are tested to see if they have inconstant hearts in love. And if they prove to be unfaithful in love, they get trapped there. But I will note, I've noted this before, she didn't abuse them there. They were actually quite happy in the Val Saint Retour. She took good care of them. They were just trapped because they proved that they weren't worthy of staying faithful. And we just see this all the way through the Arthurian legends, this concept of the fairy woman testing the knights. It's rooted in that Celtic lore, as I've said multiple times in this video. There are other fairy women in Celtic lore who test knights who aren't directly in the Arthurian legends. The Morrigan is an obvious one. She tests Cuchulainn, and he ends up dying because he doesn't pass her tests. But you really should just sleep with a war goddess if she wants to sleep with you. That's part of the Cuchulainn issue there. If she wants to sleep with you to bless your battle, you should sleep with her. The Dagda did sleep with her to bless a battle, and he won. Cuchulainn ended up dying on the battlefield. That was just another example from another branch of the Celtic lore. And with that, I am going to bring this video to a close. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you've liked this video. If you do, please like, comment, subscribe, and check out my blog at roseofavalon.life. Bye.